Welcome back to the Deep Dive. For all our listeners joining us on this journey through modern Indian history,
Especially those preparing for the UPSC exams.
yeah,
Big one.
we are jumping right back into the world of British land revenue systems in India.
Fascinating stuff.
This is part 2 of our deep dive into this era. And
Yeah.
trust me,
Oh,
understanding this is going to be crucial for that GS1 paper. So
absolutely.
grab your notes, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And let's get started. Okay. Last time, we talked about how the British were always trying new things, experimenting with the ways to collect revenue from the land. Right today, we're focusing on the Ryotwari system.
The Ryotwari system. Introduced in 1820, brainchild of Captain Alexander Reed and Sir Thomas Monro. Rolled out first in Madras, what we know as Tamil Nadu today.
Okay, so new system, new players on the field. How did this Ryotwari system actually change things on the ground? Was it a complete overhaul or more of a tweak to what was already in place?
It was a major shift, definitely not just a tweak. The British decided to go straight to the source, the individual cultivator, or Ryot, and cut out the middleman.
Interesting.
Remember the zamindari system?
Oh, yeah.
With those powerful zamindars collecting taxes, they were basically sidelined.
Wow. So no more zamindars taking a cut. That sounds like a big change. Did this actually give more power to the farmers?
Well, the idea was to create a direct relationship between the British government and the Ryot. The Ryot was recognized as the landowner with rights to sell, transfer, or even mortgage their land.
Wow.
On paper,
Yeah.
it seemed like a step towards empowering them.
On paper. You're making me think there's more to this story. Was it all sunshine and rainbows for the farmers?
And not exactly. Like a lot of things in history, especially when it comes to colonial rule, the reality was more complicated. The Ryotwari system did offer some potential benefits, but there were some serious downsides too. Downsides that ended up hurting the very farmers it was supposed to help.
Okay, I was just about to ask. It couldn't have been all good. What were some of the downsides of this seemingly empowering system?
One major problem was that the revenue assessments, they were often completely inaccurate. Imagine this. They weren't based on what a farmer actually produced, but on some theoretical potential of the soil.
Hold on.
Yeah.
So even if a farmer had a bad year because of a drought or pests, they were still expected to pay this idealistic tax amount. That sounds really harsh.
It was. And on top of that, the tax rates themselves were incredibly high, often taking 50%, or even more of what a farmer produced.
Well,
So even in a good year, they were giving up a huge part of their income.
okay. Faulty assessments and sky-high taxes. That's a recipe for disaster. It sounds like this system might have made things even harder for a lot of farmers. What happened when they just couldn't pay?
Well, that's where things get really bad. Many farmers, desperate to meet these crazy tax demands, ended up in the hands of local moneylenders.
I can see where this is going. Those money lenders charging huge interest rates, taking advantage of farmers already in a tough spot. It's almost like a new kind of middleman appeared, even though the system was supposed to get rid of them.
Exactly. These moneylenders, often called mahajans, they became a key part of this system. But their role was often exploitative. They lent money to farmers at ridiculous interest rates, knowing that these farmers were in a really vulnerable position.
Ugh,
Yeah.
not good.
No. It created a vicious cycle of debt for a lot of farmers. They would borrow to pay their taxes, but then they couldn't repay the loan with the interest, so they borrowed more. And it just kept getting worse.
A classic debt trap.
Yeah.
So what happened when farmers couldn't even pay the interest to the moneylenders?
The worst case. They lost their land. You remember how the Ryotwari system gave ryots the right to mortgage their land?
Right.
Well, that right often became their downfall. They would use their land as collateral, and if they defaulted, the moneylenders would seize it.
So a system designed to give farmers ownership
Yeah.
could actually lead to them losing their land. That's pretty ironic.
It is.
It seems like the Ryotwari system, despite its good intentions, had some pretty serious unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And those consequences went far beyond just the impact on individual farmers. They really shaped the social and economic landscape of India for generations.
Okay. Now you've got me interested. Tell me more about those long-term impacts.
Well, for one, the Ryotwari system. By recognizing individual ownership, it unintentionally created a new class of landowners. Before, land ownership was mostly in the hands of the zamindars.
Right.
But now, you had a whole new group of people who technically owned their land.
So you're saying this system led to a more equal distribution of land ownership?
Not exactly. While some cultivators did benefit, others were pushed into poverty. Because of those high taxes and the debt trap,
Mm.
this actually contributed to a bigger gap between those who owned land and those who didn't.
So it's like the system backfired.
Yeah,
It was supposed to empower farmers,
right.
but for many,
Yeah.
they made more vulnerable.
Exactly. And this growing inequality between landowners and landless laborers, it had a huge impact on rural India. It created tensions, reinforced existing hierarchies, and even contributed to social movements later on.
It's amazing how something like a land revenue system can have such a big social impact.
It is.
What about the economic consequences? Did the Ryotwari system affect India's economy?
Absolutely. One major consequence was the shift towards cash crops, the high revenue demands. They forced farmers to focus on growing crops they could sell quickly for cash, things like cotton, indigo, and opium.
So instead of growing food for themselves and their communities, they were pressured to grow crops that would make money for the British government.
Exactly. This shift to cash crops had mixed results. On one hand, it did bring the Indian economy into the global market. These cash crops were in high demand, especially in Britain, which was industrializing rapidly.
So Indian cotton, for example,
Yep.
was being used in the British textile industry.
That's right. But on the other hand, this dependence on cash crops made Indian agriculture really vulnerable to price changes in the world market. If the price of cotton or indigo dropped, Indian farmers were the ones who suffered.
It sounds like a risky system,
Yeah,
especially for those already struggling.
it was. It tied the fate of Indian farmers to the global market,
Mm-hmm.
which they had no control over. This vulnerability continued even after independence.
Wow. We covered a lot today, from the goals of the Ryotwari system to its unintended consequences and its impact on India. It's clear that this was a turning point, one that had huge implications.
It really was, and it shows how policies can have complex and unexpected outcomes. It highlights the importance of understanding the historical context and looking deeper to understand these events.
I agree. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Exactly. And for our listeners preparing for the UPSC exams, this kind of critical thinking is important for the GS1 paper. Understanding the Ryotwari system, its details, and its long-term effects is essential for those history questions.
Absolutely. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding how events are connected
Yeah.
and their consequences. But before we move on, there's one more piece of this puzzle we need to look at. The other land revenue systems
Right.
that were implemented alongside the Ryotwari system.
Right. Comparing the Ryotwari system with the Zamindari and Mohalwari systems is crucial for understanding this era. It will help you see the bigger picture of British land revenue policies and their impact on India.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We are in the final part of our exploration of British land revenue systems in India, and I'm excited to compare the Ryotwari system with the other two major systems, the Zamindari and the Mohalwari.
It is fascinating how the British tried different approaches to collecting land revenue, and each system had its own unique impact on Indian society and the economy.
Okay, let's start with the Zamindari system, which we touched on before. Remind me how that one worked.
The Zamindari system was the oldest, and in a way, the simplest. The British appointed local landlords, called zamindars, to collect revenue from the cultivators. The zamindars had to pay a fixed amount to the British, and they could set their own rates and collect whatever they could from the farmers.
So the Zamindars had a lot of power in this system. It sounds like there was a lot of room for abuse.
You are right. The zamindari system often led to high taxes and oppression of the cultivators. Because the zamindars wanted to make as much money as possible, it also created a rigid social hierarchy. With the zamindars at the top, this just solidified their power and influence.
Okay. How was the Mohalwari system different from the Zamindari system?
The Mohalwari system was kind of a hybrid approach. It was introduced in parts of North India, mostly in the Gangetic Plains. Instead of dealing with individual cultivators, like in the Ryotwari system, or powerful zamindars, the Mohalwari system focused on whole villages, or mahals, as the unit for revenue collection.
So the entire village was responsible for paying.
Right.
Interesting. How did that actually work?
Well, the revenue was assessed on the whole mahal, and the village headman had to collect the revenue from each cultivator and pay it to the British. This system was meant to find a balance between the individual responsibility of the Ryotwari and the landlord-based zamindari system.
So it sounds like the British were trying to find a system that was efficient but also fair. Did they succeed?
Not really. The Mohalwari system might have seemed fair in theory, but it still had problems. Assessing revenue on the whole village often caused disagreements and inequality within the village. It also didn't stop exploitation. because powerful people in the village could still use the system to their advantage.
I see a pattern here. It seems like no matter what system the British tried, they couldn't escape the problems of colonial rule.
Exactly. Each system had its own good and bad points, but they all served the main purpose of making as much money as possible for the British Empire. And this often hurt Indian farmers and the Indian economy.
This comparison has been so helpful. It's helped me understand the connections between these systems and see the broader context of British land revenue policies in India.
I'm glad to hear that. And for our listeners studying for the UPSC exams, this comparative approach is really important. It's not just about knowing the facts about each system, it's about understanding their strengths and weaknesses, their impact on different regions and groups, and their consequences for India.
You're right. This deep dive has given our listeners the knowledge and the skills they need to succeed on those exams. And even more importantly, it's given us a deeper understanding of this important period in Indian history.
It reminds us that history is not just dates and events. It's a complex web of interconnected forces that still affect us today. And as you keep exploring modern Indian history, keep asking questions, challenge your assumptions, and connect the past to the present.
That's a perfect way to wrap things up. We hope this deep dive into British land revenue systems has made you curious and given you a new way of looking at this part of Indian history. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.